Welcome to the 9th installment in this reading of Madame Bovary. If you enjoy these readings, it would be great if you could consider subscribing and perhaps even click that like button. In doing so, you would greatly help me grow the channel. I am deeply grateful for your support. And now, without any further delay, let us continue to Part 2, Chapter 13. No sooner was Rodolphe at home than he sat down quickly at his bureau, under the stag's head that hung as a trophy on the wall. But when he had the pen between his fingers, he could think of nothing, so that, resting on his elbows, he began to reflect. Emma seemed to him to have receded into a far-off past, as if the resolution he had taken had suddenly placed a distance between them. To get back something of her, he fetched from the cupboard at the bedside an old Rame biscuit box, in which he usually kept his letters from women, and from it came an odor of dry dust and withered roses. First he saw a handkerchief with pale little spots. It was a handkerchief of hers. Once, when they were walking, her nose had bled. He had forgotten it. Near it, chipped at all the corners, was a miniature given him by Emma. Her toilette seemed to him pretentious, and her languishing look in the worst possible taste. Then, from looking at this image and recalling the memory of its original, Emma's features little by little grew confused in his remembrance, as if the living and the painted face, rubbing one against the other, had effaced each other. Finally, he read some of her letters. They were full of explanations relating to their journey, short, technical, and urgent, like business notes. He wanted to see the long ones again, those of old times. In order to find them at the bottom of the box, Rodolphe disturbed all the others and mechanically began rummaging amidst this mass of papers and things, finding pell-mell bouquets, garters, a black mask, pins, and hair. Hair, dark and fair, some even catching in the hinges of the box, broke when it was opened. Thus, dallying with his souvenirs, he examined the writing and the style of the letters, as varied as their orthography. They were tender or jovial, facetious, melancholy. There were some that asked for love, others asked for money. A word recalled faces to him, certain gestures, the sound of a voice. Sometimes, however, he remembered nothing at all. In fact, these women rushing at once into his thoughts crammed each other and lessened, as reduced to a uniform level of love that equalized them all. So, taking handfuls of the mixed-up letters, he amused himself for some moments with letting them fall in cascades from his right into his left hand. At last, bored and weary, Rodolphe took back the box to the cupboard, saying to himself, "What a lot of rubbish," which summed up his opinion, for pleasures, like schoolboys in a school courtyard, had so trampled up his heart that no green thing grew there, and that which passed through it, more heedless than children, did not even, like them, leave a name carved upon the wall. "Come," said he, "let's begin." He wrote, "Courage, Emma, courage. I would not bring misery into your life." After all, that's true, thought Rodolphe. I am acting in her interest. I am honest. Have you carefully weighed your resolution? Do you know to what an abyss I was dragging you, poor angel? No, you do not, do you? You were coming confident and fearless, believing in happiness in the future. Ah, unhappy that we are, insensate. Rodolphe stopped here to think of some good excuse. If I told her all my fortune is lost? No. Besides, that would stop nothing. It would all have to be begun over again later on. As if one could make women like that listen to reason. He reflected, then went on. I shall not forget you. Oh, believe it, and I shall ever have a profound devotion for you. But some day, sooner or later, this ardor, such is the fate of human things, would have grown less, no doubt. Lassitude would have come to us, and who knows if I should not even have had the atrocious pain of witnessing your remorse, of sharing it myself, since I should have been its cause. The mere idea of the grief that would come to you tortures me, Emma. Forget me. Why did I ever know you? Why were you so beautiful? Is it my fault? Oh my God. No, no, accuse only fate. That's a word that always tells, he said to himself. Ah, if you had been one of those frivolous women that one sees, certainly I might, through egotism, have tried an experiment, in that case without danger for you. But that delicious exaltation, at once your charm and your torment, has prevented you from understanding, adorable woman that you are, the falseness of our future position. Nor had I reflected upon this at first, and I rested in the shade of that ideal happiness as beneath that of the mansionel tree, without foreseeing the consequences. Perhaps she'll think I'm giving it up for avarice. Ah well, so much the worse. It must be stopped. The world is cruel, Emma. Wherever we might have gone, it would have persecuted us. You would have had to put up with indiscreet questions, calumny, contempt, insult perhaps. Insult to you. Oh, and I, who would place you on a throne. I, who bear with me your memory as a talisman. For I am going to punish myself by exile for all the ill I have done to you. I am going away. Whither I know not. I am mad. Adieu. Be good always. Preserve the memory of the unfortunate who has lost you. Teach my name to your children. Let her repeat it in her prayers. The wicks of the candles flickered. Rodolphe got up to shut the window, and when he had, sat down again. I think it's all right. Ah, and this for fear she should come and hunt me up. I shall be far away when you read these sad lines. For I have wished to flee as quickly as possible, to shun the temptation of seeing you again. No weakness. I shall return, and perhaps later on we shall talk together very coldly of our love. Adieu. And there was a last adieu, divided into two words. Ah, Dieu, which he thought in very excellent taste. Now, how am I to sign? He said to himself. Yours devotedly? No. Your friend? Yes, that's it. Your friend. He reread his letter. He considered it very good. Poor little woman, he thought with emotion. She'll think me harder than a rock. There ought to have been some tears on this, but I can't cry. It isn't my fault. Then, having emptied some water into a glass, Rodolphe dipped his finger into it and let a big drop fall on the paper that made a pale stain on the ink. Then, looking for a seal, he came upon the one, Amor nel cor. Well, that doesn't at all fit with the circumstances. Shush. Never mind. after which she smoked 3 pipes and went to bed. The next day, when he was up, at about 2 o'clock, he had slept late. Rodolphe had a basket of apricots picked. He put his letter at the bottom under some vine leaves, and at once ordered Girard, his ploughman, to take it with care to Madame Bovary. He made use of this means for corresponding with her, sending, according to the season, fruits or game. If she asks after me, he said, you will tell her that I have gone on a journey. You must give the basket to her herself, into her own hands. Get along and take care. Girard put on his new blouse, knotted his handkerchief around the apricots, and, walking with great heavy steps in his thick iron-bound galoshes, made his way to Yonville. Madame Bovary, when he got to her house, was arranging a bundle of linen on the kitchen table with Félicité. Here, said the ploughboy, is something for you, from the master. She was seized with apprehension, and as she sought in her pocket for some coppers, she looked at the peasant with haggard eyes, while he himself looked at her with amazement, not understanding how such a present could so move anyone. At last he went out. Félicité remained. She could bear it no longer. She ran into the sitting room as if to take the apricots there, overturned the basket, tore away the leaves, found the letter, opened it. And as if some fearful fire were behind her, Emma flew to her room, terrified. Charles was there. She saw him. He spoke to her. She heard nothing. And she went on quickly up the stairs, breathless, distraught, dumb, and ever holding this horrible piece of paper that crackled between her fingers like a plate of sheet iron. On the second floor, she stopped before the attic door, which was closed. Then she tried to calm herself. She recalled the letter. She must finish it. She did not dare to. And where? How? She would be seen. Ah, no. Here, she thought, I shall be all right. Emma pushed open the door and went in. The slates threw straight down a heavy heat that gripped her temples, stifled her. She dragged herself to the closed garret window. She drew back the bolt, and the dazzling light burst in with a leap. Opposite, beyond the roofs, stretched the open country till it was lost to sight. Down below, underneath her, the village square was empty. The stones of the pavement glittered. The weathercocks on the houses were motionless. At the corner of the street, from a lower story, rose a kind of humming with strident modulations. It was Binet turning. She leaned against the embrasure of the window and reread the letter with angry sneers. But the more she fixed her attention upon it, the more confused were her ideas. She saw him again, heard him, encircled him with her arms, and throbs of her heart, that beat against her breast like blows of a sledgehammer, grew faster and faster, with uneven intervals. She looked about her with the wish that the earth might crumble into pieces. Why not end it all? What restrained her? She was free. She advanced, looking at the paving stones, saying to herself, "Come, come." The luminous ray that came straight up from below drew the weight of her body towards the abyss. It seemed to her that the ground of the oscillating square went up the walls, and that the floor dipped on end like a tossing boat. She was right at the edge, almost hanging, surrounded by a vast space. The blue of the heavens suffused her. The air was whirling in her hollow head. She had but to yield, to let herself be taken, and the humming of the lath never ceased, like an angry voice calling her. "Emma, Emma," cried Charles. She stopped. Wherever are you? Come. The thought that she had just escaped from death almost made her faint with terror. She closed her eyes. Then she shivered at the touch of a hand on her sleeves. It was Félicité. Master is waiting for you, madame. The soup is on the table. And she had to go down to sit at the table. She tried to eat, and the food choked her. Then she unfolded a napkin as if to examine the darns, and she really thought of applying herself to this work, counting the threads in the linen. Suddenly the remembrance of the letter returned to her. How had she lost it? Where could she find it? But she felt such weariness of spirit that she could not even invent a pretext for leaving the table. Then she became a coward. She was afraid of Charles. He knew all that was certain. Indeed, he pronounced these words in a strange manner. We are not likely to see Monsieur Rodolphe soon again, it seems. Who told you? She said, shuddering. Who told me? He replied, rather astonished at her abrupt tone. Why, Girard, whom I met just now at the door of the Café Français. He has gone on a journey, or is to go. She gave a sob. What surprises you in that? He absents himself like that from time to time for a change, and, ma foi, I think he's right, when one has a fortune and is a bachelor. Besides, he has jolly times, has our friend. He's a bit of a rake, Monsieur Langlois told me. He stopped for propriety's sake because the servant came in. She put back into the basket the apricots scattered on the sideboard. Charles, without noticing his wife's color, had them brought to him, took one, and bit into it. Ah, perfect, said he. Just taste. And he handed her the basket, which she put away from her gently. Do just smell. What an odor, he remarked, passing it under her nose several times. I am choking, she cried, leaping up. But by an effort of will the spasm passed. Then, it is nothing, she said. It is nothing. It is nervousness. Sit down. Go on eating. For she dreaded lest he should begin questioning her, attending to her, that she should not be left alone. Charles, to obey her, sat down again, and he spat the stones of the apricots into his hands, afterwards putting them on his plate. Suddenly, a blue tilbury passed across the square at a rapid trot. Emma uttered a cry and fell back rigid to the ground. In fact, Rodolphe, after many reflections, had decided to set out for Rouen. Now, as from La Huchette to Buchy, there is no other way than by Yonville. He had to go through the village, and Emma had recognized him by the rays of the lanterns, which, like lightning, flashed through the twilight. The chemist, at the tumult which broke out in the house, ran thither. The table, with all the plates, was upset. Sauce, meat, knives, the salt, and cruet stand were strewn over the room. Charles was calling for help. Berthe, scared, was crying. And Félicité, whose hands trembled, was unlacing her mistress, whose whole body shivered convulsively. I'll run to my laboratory for some aromatic vinegar, said the druggist. Then, as she opened her eyes on smelling the bottle, I was sure of it, he remarked. That would wake any dead person for you. Speak to us, said Charles. Collect yourself, it is your Charles who loves you. Do you know me? See? Here is your little girl. Oh, kiss her. The child stretched out her arms to her mother to cling to her neck, but turning away her head, Emma said in a broken voice, No, no, no one. She fainted again. They carried her to her bed. She lay there stretched at full length, her lips apart, her eyelids closed, her hands open, motionless, and white as a waxen image. 2 streams of tears flowed from her eyes and fell slowly upon the pillow. Charles, standing up, was at the back of the alcove, and the chemist near him maintained that meditative silence that is becoming on the serious occasions of life. "Not to be uneasy," he said, touching his elbow. "I think the paroxysm is past." "Yes, she is resting a little now," answered Charles, watching her sleep. Poor girl, poor girl. She had gone off now. Then Homais asked how the accident had come about. Charles answered that she had been taken ill suddenly while she was eating some apricots. "Extraordinary," continued the chemist, "but it might be that the apricots had brought on the syncope. Some natures are so sensitive to certain smells, and it would even be a very fine question to study both in its pathological and physiological relation. The priests know the importance of it, they who have introduced aromatics into all their ceremonies. It is to stupefy the senses and to bring on ecstasies, a thing, moreover, very easy in persons of the weaker sex, who are more delicate than the other. Some are cited who faint at the smell of burnt hartshorn, of new bread. "Take care, you'll wake her," said Bovary in a low voice. "And not only," the druggist went on, "are human beings subject to such anomalies, but animals also. Thus, you are not ignorant of the singularly aphrodisiac effect produced by the Nepeta cataria, vulgarly called catmint, on the feline race. And on the other hand, to quote an example whose authenticity I can answer for, Brideau, one of my old comrades at present established in the Rue Malpalu, possesses a dog that falls into convulsions as soon as you hold out a snuff-box to him. He often even makes the experiment before his friends at his summer house at Guillaume-Bout. Would anyone believe that a simple sternutation could produce such ravages on a quadrupedal organism? It is extremely curious, is it not?" Yes," said Charles, who was not listening to him. "This shows us," went on the other, smiling with benign self-sufficiency, "the innumerable irregularities of the nervous system. With regard to Madame, she has always seemed to me, I confess, very susceptible. And so, I should by no means recommend to you, my dear friend, any of those so-called remedies that, under the pretense of attacking the symptoms, attack the constitution. No useless physicking. Diet, and that is all. Sedatives, emollients, dulcification. Then, don't you think that perhaps her imagination should be worked upon?" "In what way? How?" said Bovary. "That is it. Such is indeed the question. That is the question, as I lately read in a newspaper." But Emma, waking, cried out, "The letter! The letter!" They thought she was delirious, and she was by midnight. Brain fever had set in. For 43 days, Charles did not leave her. He gave up all his patients. He no longer went to bed. He was constantly feeling her pulse, putting on sinapisms and cold water compresses. He sent Justin as far as Neufchâtel for ice. The ice melted on the way. He sent him back again. He called Monsieur Canivet into consultation. He sent for Dr. Larivière, his old master from Rouen. He was in despair. What alarmed him most was Emma's prostration, for she did not speak, did not listen, did not even seem to suffer, as if her body and soul were both resting together after all their troubles. About the middle of October, she could sit up in bed, supported by pillows. Charles wept when he saw her eat her first bread and jelly. Her strength returned to her. She got up for a few hours of an afternoon. And one day, when she felt better, he tried to take her, leaning on his arm, for a walk around the garden. The sand of the paths was disappearing beneath the dead leaves. She walked slowly, dragging along her slippers, and leaning against Charles's shoulder. She smiled all the time. They went thus to the bottom of the garden near the terrace. She drew herself up slowly, shading her eyes with her hand to look. She looked far off, as far as she could, but on the horizon were only great bonfires of grass smoking on the hills. "You will tire yourself, my darling," said Bovary, and, pushing her gently to make her go into the arbor, "sit down on the seat. You'll be comfortable." "Oh no, not there," she said in a faltering voice. She was seized with giddiness, and from that evening her illness recommenced with a more uncertain character, it is true, and more complex symptoms. Now she suffered in her heart, then in the chest, the head, the limbs. She had vomitings, in which Charles thought he saw first signs of cancer. And besides this, the poor fellow was worried about money matters. Part 2, Chapter 14. To begin with, he did not know how he could pay Monsieur Homais for all the physics supplied by him. And though, as a medical man, he was not obliged to pay for it, he nevertheless blushed a little at such an obligation. Then the expenses of the household, now that the servant was mistress, became terrible. Bills rained in upon the house. The tradesmen grumbled. Monsieur Lheureux especially harassed him. In fact, at the height of Emma's illness, the latter, taking advantage of the circumstances to make his bill larger, had hurriedly brought the cloak, the travelling bag, 2 trunks instead of 1, and a number of other things. It was very well for Charles to say he did not want them. The tradesman answered arrogantly that these articles had been ordered and that he would not take them back. Besides, it would vex Madame in her convalescence. The doctor had better think it over. In short, he was resolved to sue him rather than give up his rights and take back his goods. Charles, subsequently, ordered them to be sent back to the shop. Félicité forgot he had other things to attend to, and then thought no more about them. Monsieur Lheureux returned to the charge, and by turns, threatening and whining, so managed that Bovary ended up by signing a bill at 6 months. But hardly had he signed this bill than a bold idea occurred to him. It was to borrow 1,000 francs from Lheureux. So, with an embarrassed air, he asked if it were possible to get them, adding that it would be for a year, at any interest he wished. Lheureux ran off to his shop, brought back the money, and dictated another bill, by which Bovary undertook to pay to his order, on the 1st of September next, the sum of 1,070 francs, which, with the 180 already agreed to, made just 1,250, thus lending at 6% in addition to 1/4 for commission, and the things bringing him a good third at the least. This ought in 12 months to give him a profit of 130 francs. He hoped that the business would not stop there, that the bills would not be paid, that they would be renewed, and that his poor little money, having thriven at the doctor's as at a hospital, would come back to him one day considerably more plump and fat enough to burst his bag. Everything, moreover, succeeded with him. He was adjudicator for a supply of cider to the hospital at Neuchâtel. Monsieur Guillaumin promised him some shares in the turf pits of Gomes Mill, and he dreamt of establishing a new diligence service between Arcueil and Rouen, which no doubt would not be long in ruining the ramshackle van of the Lion d'Or, and that, travelling faster at a cheaper rate and carrying more luggage, would thus put into his hands the whole commerce of Yonville. Charles several times asked himself by what means he should next year be able to pay back so much money. He reflected, imagined expedients, such as applying to his father or selling something, but his father would be deaf, and he had nothing to sell. Then he foresaw such worries that he quickly dismissed so disagreeable a subject of meditation from his mind. He reproached himself with forgetting Emma, as if all his thoughts belonging to this woman, it was robbing her of something not to be constantly thinking of her. The winter was severe. Madame Bovary's convalescence slow. When it was fine, they wheeled her armchair to the window that overlooked the square, for she now had an antipathy to the garden, and the blinds on that side were always down. She wished the horse to be sold. What she formerly liked now displeased her. All her ideas seemed to be limited to the care of herself. She stayed in bed, taking little meals, rang for the servant to inquire about her gruel, or to chat with her. The snow on the market roof threw a white, still light into the room. Then the rain began to fall, and Emma waited daily with a mind full of eagerness for the inevitable return of some trifling events, which nevertheless had no relation to her. The most important was the arrival of the Hirondelle in the evening. Then the landlady shouted out, and other voices answered, while Hippolyte's lantern, as he fetched the boxes from the boot, was like a star in the darkness. At midday, Charles came in. Then he went out again. Next, she took some beef tea, and towards 5 o'clock, as the day drew in, the children coming back from school, dragging their wooden shoes along the pavement, knocked the clapper of the shutters with their rulers, one after the other. It was at this hour that Monsieur Bournisien came to see her. He inquired after her health, gave her news, exhorted her to religion, in a coaxing little prattle that was not without its charm. The mere thought of his cassock comforted her. One day, when at the height of her illness she had thought herself dying, and had asked for the communion, and, while they were making the preparations in her room for the sacrament, while they were turning the night table covered with syrups into an altar, and while Félicité was strewing dahlia flowers on the floor, Emma felt some power passing over her that freed her from her pains, from all perception, from all feeling. Her body, relieved, no longer thought. Another life was beginning. It seemed to her that her being, mounted toward God, would be annihilated in that love like a burning incense that melts into vapor. The bedclothes were sprinkled with holy water. The priest drew from the holy pyx the white wafer, and it was fainting with a celestial joy that she put out her lips to accept the body of the Saviour presented to her. The curtains of the alcove floated gently round her like clouds, and the rays of the 2 tapers burning on the night table seemed to shine like dazzling halos. Then she let her head fall back, fancying she heard in space the music of seraphic harps, and perceived in an azure sky, on a golden throne in the midst of saints holding green palms, God the Father, resplendent with majesty, who, with a sign, sent to earth angels with wings of fire to carry her away in their arms. This splendid vision dwelt in her memory as the most beautiful thing that it was possible to dream, so that now she strove to recall her sensation. that still lasted, however, but in a less exclusive fashion and with a deeper sweetness. Her soul, tortured by pride, at length found rest in Christian humility, and, tasting the joy of weakness, she saw within herself the destruction of her will, that must have left a wide entrance for the inroads of heavenly grace. There existed, then, in the place of happiness, still greater joys, another love beyond all loves, without pause and without end, one that would grow eternally. She saw amid the illusions of her hope a state of purity floating above the earth, mingling with heaven, to which she aspired. She wanted to become a saint. She bought chaplets and wore amulets. She wished to have in her room, by the side of her bed, a reliquary set in emeralds, that she might kiss it every evening. The curé marveled at this humor, although Emma's religion, he thought, might, from its fervor and by touching on heresy, extravagance. But not being much versed in these matters, as soon as they went beyond a certain limit, he wrote to Monsieur Boulard, bookseller to Monseigneur, to send him something good for a lady who was very clever. And the bookseller, with much indifference, packed up, pell-mell, everything that was then the fashion in the pious book trade. There were little manuals in questions and answers, pamphlets of aggressive tone after the manner of Monsieur Mistret, and certain novels in rose-colored bindings and with a honeyed style, manufactured by troubadour seminarists or penitent bluestockings. There were the, think of it, The Man of the World at Mary's Feet, by Monsieur de something rather, decorated with many orders, The Errors of Voltaire, for the use of the young, etc. Madame Bovary's mind was not yet sufficiently clear to apply herself seriously to anything. Moreover, she began this reading in too much hurry. She grew provoked at the doctrines of religion. The arrogance of the polemic writings displeased her by their inveteracy in attacking people she did not know. And the secular stories, relieved with religion, seemed to her written in such ignorance of the world that they insensibly estranged her from the truths for whose proof she was looking. Nevertheless, she persevered. And when the volume slipped from her hands, she fancied herself seized with the finest Catholic melancholy that an ethereal soul could conceive. As for the memory of Rodolphe, she had thrust it back to the bottom of her heart, and it remained there, more solemn and more motionless than a king's mummy in a catacomb. An exhalation escaped from this embalmed love, that penetrating through everything, perfumed with tenderness the immaculate atmosphere in which she longed to live. When she knelt on her Gothic prie-dieu, she addressed to the Lord the same suave words that she had murmured formerly to her lover in the outpourings of adultery. It was to make faith come, but no delights descended from the heavens, and she arose with tired limbs and with vague feeling of a gigantic dupery. This searching after faith, she thought, was only one merit the more, and in the pride of her devoutness, Emma compared herself to those grand ladies of long ago, whose glory she had dreamed of over A Portrait of La Valliere, and who, trailing with so much majesty the lace-trimmed trains of their long gowns, retired into solitudes to shed at the feet of Christ all the tears of hearts that life had wounded. Then she gave herself up to excessive charity. She sewed clothes for the poor. She sent wood to women in childbed. And Charles one day, on coming home, found 3 good-for-nothings in the kitchen, seated at the table, eating soup. She had her little girl, whom, during her illness, her husband had sent back to the nurse, brought home. She wanted to teach her to read. Even when Berthe cried, she was not vexed. She had made up her mind to resignation, to universal indulgence. Her language about everything was full of ideal expressions. She said to her child, "Is your stomach ache better, my angel?" Madame Bovary Senior found nothing to censure except perhaps this mania of knitting jackets for orphans instead of mending her own house linen. But, harassed with domestic quarrels, the good woman took pleasure in this quiet house. And she even stayed there till after Easter, to escape the sarcasms of old Bovary, who never failed on Good Friday to order chitterlings. Besides the companionship of her mother-in-law, who strengthened her a little by the rectitude of her judgment and her grave ways, Emma almost every day had other visitors. These were Madame Langlois, Madame Caron, Madame Dubreuil, Madame Tuvache, and regularly, from 2 to 5 o'clock, the excellent Madame Homais, who, for her part, had never believed any of the tittle-tattle about her neighbor. The little Homais also came to see her. Justin accompanied them. He went up with them to her bedroom and remained standing near the door, motionless and mute. Often even Madame Bovary, taking no heed of him, began her toilette. She began by taking out her comb, shaking her head with a quick movement, and when he for the first time saw all this mass of hair that fell to her knees, unrolling in black ringlets, it was to him, poor child, like a sudden entrance into something new and strange, whose splendor terrified him. Emma, no doubt, did not notice his silent attentions or his timidity. She had no suspicion that the love vanished from her life was there, palpitating by her side, beneath that coarse holland shirt, in that youthful heart, open to the emanations of her beauty. Besides, she now enveloped all things with such indifference. She had words so affectionate with looks so haughty, such contradictory ways that one could no longer distinguish egotism from charity, or corruption from virtue. One evening, for example, she was angry with the servant, who had asked to go out, and stammered as she tried to find some pretext. Then, suddenly, "So you love him," she said, and without waiting for any answer from Félicité, who was blushing, she added, "There. Run along, enjoy yourself." In the beginning of spring, she had the garden turned up from end to end, despite Bovary's remonstrances. However, he was glad to see her at last manifest a wish of any kind. As she grew stronger, she displayed more willfulness. First, she found occasion to expel Mère Rollet, the nurse, who during her convalescence had contracted the habit of coming too often to the kitchen with her 2 nurslings and her boarder, better off for teeth than a cannibal. Then she got rid of the Homais family, successively dismissing all the other visitors, and even frequented church less assiduously, to the great approval of the druggist, who said to her in a friendly way, "You were going in a bit for the cassock." As formerly, Monsieur Bournisien dropped in every day when he came out after catechism class. He preferred staying out of doors to taking the air in the grove, as he called the arbor. This was the time when Charles came home. They were hot, some sweet cider was brought out, and they drank together to Madame's complete restoration. Binet was there, that is to say, a little lower down against the terrace wall, fishing for crayfish. Bovary invited him to have a drink, and he thoroughly understood the uncorking of the stone bottles. "You must," he said, throwing a satisfied glance all around him, "even to the very extremity of the landscape. Hold the bottle perpendicularly on the table, and after the strings are cut, press up the cork with little thrusts, gently, gently, as indeed they do seltzer water at restaurants." But during his demonstration, the cider often spurted right into their faces, and then the ecclesiastic, with a thick laugh, never missed this joke. Its goodness strikes the eye. He was, in fact, a good fellow, and one day he was not even scandalized at the chemist, who advised Charles to give Madame some distraction by taking her to the theatre at Rouen to hear the illustrious tenor Lagardy. Homais, surprised at this silence, wanted to know his opinion, and the priest declared that he considered music less dangerous for morals than literature. But the chemist took up the defense of letters. The theatre, he contended, served for railing at prejudices, and beneath a mask of pleasure taught virtue. Castigat ridendo mores, or it corrects customs through laughter, Monsieur Bournisien thus considered the greater part of Voltaire's tragedies. They are cleverly strewn with philosophical reflections that made them a vast school of morals and diplomacy for the people. "I," said Binet, "once saw a piece called the Gamin de Paris, in which there was the character of an old general that is really hit off to a T. He sets down a young swell who has seduced a working girl, who at the ending—" "Oh, certainly," continued Homais, "there is bad literature as there is bad pharmacy, but to condemn in a lump the most important of the fine arts seems to me a stupidity, a Gothic idea, worthy of the abominable times that imprisoned Galileo." "I know very well," objected the curé, "that there are good works, good authors. However, if it were only those persons of different sexes united in a bewitching apartment, decorated rouge, those lights, those effeminate voices, all this must, in the long run, engender a certain mental libertinage, give rise to immodest thoughts and impure temptations. Such, at any rate, is the opinion of all the fathers. Finally," he added, suddenly assuming a mystic tone of voice, while he rolled a pinch of snuff between his fingers, "if the Church has condemned the theatre, she must be right. We must submit to her decrees." "Why," asked the druggist, "should she excommunicate actors?" "For formerly they openly took part in religious ceremonies. Yes, in the middle of the chancel they acted. They performed a kind of farce called mysteries, which often offended against the laws of decency." The ecclesiastic contented himself with uttering a groan, and the chemist went on. "It's like it is in the Bible. There are, you know, more than one piquant detail, matters really libidinous. And on a gesture of irritation from Monsieur Bournisien, you'll admit that it is not a book to place in the hands of a young girl, and I should be sorry if Athalie—" "But it is the Protestants and not we," cried the other impatiently, "who recommend the Bible." "No matter," said Homais. "I am surprised that in our days, in this century of enlightenment, anyone should still persist in prescribing an intellectual relaxation that is inoffensive, moralizing, and sometimes even hygienic. Is it not, doctor?" "No doubt," replied the doctor carelessly, either because, sharing the same ideas, he wished to offend no one, or else because he had not any ideas. The conversation seemed at an end when the chemist thought fit to shoot a Parthian arrow. I've known priests who put on ordinary clothes to go and see dancers kicking about. Come, come, said the curé. I've known some. And separating the words of his sentence, Homais repeated, I have known some. Well, they were wrong, said Bournisien, resigned to anything. By Jove, they go in for more than that, exclaimed the druggist. Sir, replied the ecclesiastic with such angry eyes that the druggist was intimidated by them. I only mean to say, he replied in less brutal a tone, that toleration is the surest way to draw people to religion. That is true, agreed the good fellow, sitting down again on his chair. But he stayed only a few moments. Then, as soon as he had gone, Monsieur Homais said to the doctor, that's what I call a cockfight. I beat him, did you see? In a way. Now take my advice. Take Madame to the theatre, if it were only for once in your life, to enrage one of these ravens. Hang it. If anyone could take my place, I would accompany you myself. Be quick about it. Lachaudy is only going to give one performance. He's engaged to go to England at a high salary. From what I hear, he's a regular dog. He's rolling in money. He's taking 3 mistresses and a cook along with him. All these great artists burn the candle at both ends. They require a dissolute life that suits the imagination to some extent. But they die at the hospital because they haven't the sense when young to lay by. Well, a pleasant dinner. Goodbye, till tomorrow. The idea of the theatre quickly germinated in Bovary's head, for he at once communicated it to his wife, who at first refused, alleging the fatigue, the worry, the expense. But for a wonder, Charles did not give in. So sure was he that this recreation would be good for her. He saw nothing to prevent it. His mother had sent them 300 francs, which he had no longer expected. The current debts were not very large, and the falling in of Lheureux's bill was still so far off that there was no need to think about them. Besides, imagining that she was refusing from delicacy, he insisted the more. So that by dint of worrying her, she at last made up her mind, and the next day at 8 o'clock they set out in the Hirondelle. The druggist, whom nothing whatever kept at Yonville, but who thought himself bound not to budge from it, sighed as he saw them go. Well, a pleasant journey, he said to them. Happy mortals that you are. Then, addressing himself to Emma, who was wearing a blue silk gown with 4 flounces, you're as lovely as a Venus. You'll cut a figure at Rouen. The diligence stopped at the Croix Rouge in the Place Beauvoisin. It was the inn that is in every provincial faubourg, with large stables and small bedrooms, where one sees in the middle of the court chickens pilfering the oats under the muddy gigs of the commercial travellers. A good old house, with worm-eaten balconies that creak in the wind, on winter nights, always full of people, noise, and feeding, whose black tables are sticky with coffee and brandy, the thick windows made yellow by the flies, the damp napkins stained with cheap wine, and that always smells of the village, like ploughboys dressed in Sunday clothes. There's a cafe on the street, and towards the countryside a kitchen garden. Charles at once set out. He muddled up the stage boxes with the gallery, the pit with the boxes, asked for explanations, did not understand them, was sent from the box office to the acting manager, came back to the inn, returned to the theatre, and thus, several times, traversed the whole length of town, from the theatre to the boulevard. Madame Bovary bought a bonnet, gloves, and a bouquet. The doctor was much afraid of missing the beginning, and, without having had time to swallow a plate of soup, they presented themselves at the doors of the theatre, which were still closed.